September 19th, 1944. The shattered forests of Lorraine trembled beneath the thunder of war. Smoke drifted over broken villages where the German 11th Panzer Division had dug in, confident that no American armor could breach their defenses. Then, from the mist, came a sound unlike any tank engine they had heard before, a shriek of speed, a mechanical roar that didn't crawl toward them, but hunted. Within minutes, their forward scouts were gone, their flanks shredded by a machine that vanished before counterfire could reach it. The Germans called it Der Blitzjäger, the lightning hunter. Its real name was the M18 Hellcat. Built not from brute steel, but from a concept that defied tank logic, the Hellcat was America's fastest armored killer, capable of hitting 55 miles per hour. To German commanders, the idea was absurd. A tank destroyer that could move faster than their own reconnaissance cars? But this was no ordinary vehicle. Designed by Harley Earl's team at Buick, the same minds that crafted peacetime luxury, it was stripped to its bones, its armor paper-thin, its engine screaming like an aircraft. The Hellcat wasn't made to take hits. It was made to strike first, vanish, and strike again. In the chaos of France's hedgerows and broken towns, it redefined armored warfare. German Panthers and Tigers, monstrous and slow, were engineered for frontal duels, steel behemoths meant to dominate the battlefield. But the Hellcat didn't play by those rules. American crews learned to lure their prey into narrow lanes, feint retreat, then swing around with impossible agility. Within seconds, their 76mm gun would punch through German armor before the enemy even rotated their turret. Survivors wrote of ghost tanks, shapes appearing on the horizon, firing once, and disappearing into the dust. That September, near Aracourt, German command believed they were fighting an entire armored regiment. In truth, it was fewer than 30 Hellcats, darting through fog and farmland like predators in the dark. General Hasso von Manteuffel, a veteran of the Eastern Front, described the engagement as unreal, like chasing phantoms that killed from nowhere. The myth of German armored invincibility shattered that week, not under the weight of bigger guns or thicker armor, but beneath the speed, precision, and audacity of a machine no one believed should exist. The Hellcat had rewritten the rules of the battlefield, but its creation, and the secret reason it moved like no other tank in history, lay buried deep within classified engineering files the Army tried to forget. The story of the M18 Hellcat began years before it rolled across Europe, hidden within the quiet halls of the Ordnance Department and Buick's Flint assembly line. In 1942, while German engineers obsessed over armor thickness and mechanical complexity, a small team of American designers dared to ask a forbidden question. What if a tank didn't need to be armored to survive? To military traditionalists, it sounded suicidal. But a handful of engineers, led by Harley Earl and Colonel James H. Critchfield, saw something the rest could not. A war that was evolving faster than steel. The early prototypes were disasters. Lightweight hulls cracked under recoil. Engines overheated and caught fire. Commanders ridiculed the concept, calling it a race car pretending to be a weapon. Yet the idea persisted, pushed forward in secret trials under the codename T-70. Buick engineers stripped away every unnecessary pound. No heavy plating, no excess rivets. Even the turret armor was thinned to a point that rifle fire could pierce it. What remained was raw speed. The Wright R975 engine, originally built for aircraft, gave it the soul of a fighter plane trapped in a tank's body. When the first successful prototype was tested in 1943, military observers were stunned. The Hellcat could pivot on command, hit full throttle in seconds, and maneuver around obstacles that stopped Sherman's cold. In war rooms, senior officers debated its existence. To some, it was madness, a suicide machine. To others, it was a weapon that could redefine mobility warfare. The Army's Tank Destroyer Command approved limited production, but the details of its speed, and the unconventional metallurgy that made it possible, were classified. The hull used a composite alloy previously tested only for aircraft fuselages. It was so light that standard tank rounds could tear through it, but the trade-off was unmatched: shed velocity. Rumors spread among test crews. Some said the metal blend was based on a rejected Navy aircraft project. Others whispered it came from experimental armor research tied to the Manhattan District, the same branch that would later birth the atomic bomb. Officially, none of it was confirmed. The documentation vanished after the war, sealed in restricted archives marked Confidential, Ordnance Division, 1944. By the time production peaked, each Hellcat was a contradiction, fragile yet lethal, loud yet invisible in motion. What its designers couldn't predict was how this fragile predator would soon humiliate some of the most feared tank commanders of Hitler's army. Not with strength, but with the terrifying illusion of speed and precision that German science could never match. When the M18 Hellcat arrived in Europe during the summer of 1944, it did so quietly, without ceremony, without the thunderous debut of the Sherman or Pershing. Crews were young, often barely trained, and their orders were unnerving: engage German tanks without ever allowing them to return fire. They were told survival depended not on armor, but on nerve. The veterans of the 704th and 705th Tank Destroyer Battalions learned this lesson in blood across the hedgerows of Normandy. The first encounters with German Panthers were terrifying. One shell from a Panther's 75mm gun could incinerate a Hellcat instantly. Yet what followed defied every German expectation. The Hellcats didn't meet the enemy head-on. They circled. They vanished into the mist, using every bend in the terrain as camouflage. When the German tanks advanced, confident in their armor, the Hellcats struck from behind, their 76mm guns piercing the Panther's thin rear plating. Engagements lasted seconds, then silence. When the smoke cleared, the Germans were left staring at burning steel and empty fields. American intelligence intercepts from that period revealed chilling details. Reports from the German 11th Panzer Division described fast, reckless tank destroyers that fight like cavalry and vanish before a countermeasure can be ordered. Some believed the Americans were deploying a new class of reconnaissance weapon, not realizing it was a mass-produced vehicle operating under a revolutionary doctrine: speed as armor. The U.S. Army's Tank Destroyer Command had crafted its own secret playbook: movement, deception, and ambush over brute strength. Hellcat units operated in pairs or trios, moving independently, each one guided by radio coordination to encircle and confuse. In September 1944, at the Battle of Arcourt, these tactics reached perfection. Under gray skies and endless rain, Hellcats from the 704th Battalion faced over 80 German tanks. Outnumbered nearly 3-1, they destroyed 43 enemy machines in 2 days, their losses fewer than a dozen. German commanders, including General Hermann Balck, refused to believe the reports. They suspected air power or hidden artillery support. It wasn't until captured German officers were interrogated that they admitted something deeply unsettling. They had been outmaneuvered by tanks that moved faster than their eyes could track. For the first time, the myth of German mechanical superiority cracked. The Hellcat, a weapon dismissed as fragile and foolish, had become the nightmare of every tank commander who thought speed was a luxury, not a weapon. But beneath its victories lay a deeper truth, one that would remain classified for decades. The Hellcat's speed had come at a cost no army wanted to acknowledge. The secret cost of the Hellcat's speed was written not in its blueprints, but in the graves of the men who drove it. Behind the celebrated victories of Lorraine and Arcourt lay an unspoken truth. The M18 was as deadly to its crew as it was to the enemy. With armor barely an inch thick, every hit meant instant death. A single fragment could ignite the gasoline engine, turning the interior into a furnace. Crews called it the tin coffin, a death trap that traded survival for agility. Yet, despite the risk, soldiers volunteered to drive it. What they discovered inside those open-topped turrets changed how they understood war itself. Declassified after-action reports describe the chaos vividly. During one engagement near Nancy, a Hellcat unit was ambushed by a Tiger I concealed behind a stone wall. The first shell ripped through the Hellcat's hull and exploded the ammunition rack. The tank disintegrated in seconds, the blast so violent that nearby infantry were knocked off their feet. But even as the wreck burned, another Hellcat surged forward. Its commander, Sergeant Robert Early, maneuvered at full speed through smoke and debris, circling the Tiger like a predator closing in on wounded prey. His first shot missed. His second struck the Tiger's exposed rear and detonated its fuel. The explosion was seen from miles away. Early's crew survived, barely. His commander's log ended with a single line: "Speed saved us. Speed killed them." It was the doctrine distilled into one sentence. The Hellcat wasn't a tank in the traditional sense. It was a weaponized gamble. U.S. engineers had built it on the edge of physics, with an engine stripped from an aircraft and a transmission that overheated if pushed too long. But on the battlefield, those flaws became its strength. While German tanks burned fuel crawling across terrain, the Hellcat danced around them, moving faster than any Panzer could rotate its gun. Still, the psychological toll was immense. Survivors from Hellcat battalions later spoke of constant tension, of living inside a machine where a single mistake meant cremation. They learned to move without stopping, to shoot without aiming too long, to fight like men already dead. What haunted them most wasn't fear, it was silence. After each battle, they would return to smoking wrecks that once held friends, their names erased from reports labeled simply vehicle loss. For decades, those losses were buried beneath statistics and propaganda. The Hellcat's official story became one of glory and innovation. But the personal accounts, the ones found years later in forgotten journals and sealed unit records, told of something darker. A weapon so fast, so lethal, and so fragile that even victory carried the scent of burning fuel and flesh. By late 1944, the Germans had begun to fear the Hellcat as a ghost weapon. Unpredictable, untouchable, and devastating. Yet in the ruins of France and the forests of the Ardennes, a new kind of battle unfolded, one fought not only with armor and guns, but with deception, intelligence, and psychological warfare. The M18 had proven that speed could defeat steel. Now the Allies sought to use that same illusion, speed and confusion, to break the German mind. Intelligence files declassified decades later revealed the extent of the plan. American commanders working with the OSS deliberately spread false radio traffic suggesting entire Hellcat battalions were roaming behind enemy lines. They were not. In reality, small units were constantly shifting positions, sometimes using captured German radios to broadcast phantom orders. Panzer divisions began to waste fuel and ammunition chasing enemies that didn't exist. The psychological effect was catastrophic. German soldiers began to believe the Hellcat could appear anywhere, anytime, even at night. At the same time, U.S. engineers experimented with modifications that bordered on the impossible. One Hellcat in the 805th Battalion was fitted with radar-assisted sighting gear originally designed for aircraft interception. Another was coated with a dark, non-reflective material, an early attempt at camouflage under moonlight. The project was never officially acknowledged, but the unit's after-action logs reference Nightcat, a prototype capable of striking without headlights, guided only by sound and radio triangulation. None of those tanks survived the war. Their existence was erased from the Ordnance Department's inventory within months of Germany's surrender. Captured German diaries paint an eerie picture. In one entry dated December 18, 1944, a lieutenant of the 2nd Panzer Division wrote, "They come at night. We hear engines and screams, then silence. No tracks in the morning." Another officer compared the experience to being hunted by machines that could think. It was the perfect storm of technological mastery and fear, a weapon that turned speed into myth. As the winter deepened and the Ardennes became a white graveyard, the Hellcat's legend grew beyond its mechanical form. It was no longer just a tank destroyer. It was a symbol of a new warfare, one that shattered the slow, deliberate rhythm of tank combat that Germany had perfected. And while the world saw photographs of victorious American crews standing proudly beside their machines, what remained hidden was how much of the Hellcat's success was built on illusion, misinformation, and psychological dominance, a weapon designed as much for the mind as for the battlefield. In the frozen dawn of December 1944, during the Battle of the Bulge, the M18 Hellcat faced its greatest trial. The Ardennes had become a labyrinth of snow, fog, and silence. A killing ground where visibility was measured in yards, not miles. German armor, Panthers, Tigers, and King Tigers, surged through the forest with brutal confidence. They believed no American machine could outfight them in those conditions. But once again, they had underestimated the one weapon built not for confrontation, but for movement. The 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion, stationed near Bastogne, was cut off and encircled. Their orders were suicidal: hold the line until relief forces arrived. Fuel was scarce, temperatures dropped below freezing, and every road was clogged with wreckage. The Hellcats, light, agile, and loud, seemed ill-suited for the terrain. Yet they became the very thing that held the front together. Moving through snow-laden roads at near-impossible speed, they harassed German columns, ambushed convoys, and disappeared into forest trails no Panther could follow. A declassified field report from Major Charles B. Greene later described an event that defied all tactical logic. On December 23rd, 3 Hellcats engaged a column of 8 German tanks. Using the fog as cover, they raced downhill at full throttle, firing while in motion. A maneuver thought impossible at the time. 2 German tanks exploded before the others could return fire. The remaining 6 tried to rotate, but the Hellcats vanished, repositioning behind the ridge to strike again from a new angle. When the smoke cleared, the Germans had lost the entire column. The Hellcats escaped without a single casualty. Greene wrote, "It was as if the machines knew where the enemy would be before they arrived." Later investigations hinted at something stranger. Among the captured German documents was a field sketch of American armor with the note, "High-speed ghost units, possibly controlled by radio." The suggestion was absurd, but the fear was real. German command began to believe the Americans had developed remote-operated tank destroyers, mechanical predators guided from afar. Propaganda units quickly suppressed these reports, fearing the psychological collapse it could cause among frontline troops. But within the Allied ranks, whispers spread too. Crewmen claimed their Hellcats behaved unpredictably, responding faster than human reflexes should allow. Some said the transmission and throttle systems reacted before the driver's command. Others believed the hybrid engine, adapted from aircraft systems, had unpredictable feedback loops when pushed to full power. Engineers dismissed it as fatigue-induced superstition. Yet, the rumor persisted, that beneath the Hellcat's steel and gasoline was something more, a machine that almost seemed to sense the rhythm of war itself. When the smoke of the Ardennes finally cleared, the U.S. Army recorded the Hellcat as one of the most successful tank destroyers of the war, credited with hundreds of enemy kills and a kill-to-loss ratio unmatched by any armored vehicle on the Western Front. But in the shadows of that triumph, a darker story took shape. In the months following Germany's surrender, dozens of M18s were quietly recalled, not for display or study, but for dismantling under military supervision. Their engines were removed, their hulls cut apart, and their transmission systems classified under the War Department's Restricted Ordnance File No. 932B. The reason was never made public. Archived internal memos, released in fragments decades later, offer unsettling clues. One document, dated August 3, 1945, from the Aberdeen Proving Ground reads, "Operational irregularities observed during sustained throttle engagement. Reactivity patterns inconsistent with known mechanical lag. Further testing suspended pending directive." Another file mentions frequency bleed-through in the vehicle's electrical system. Interference reportedly strong enough to disrupt nearby radios. Engineers speculated that the aircraft-derived engine design caused resonance effects with the tank's communication circuitry. But other records, now lost or redacted, hint that the phenomenon was far less mechanical. One surviving crewman, interviewed in 1952, recalled a strange moment near Metz. His Hellcat, No. 17B, accelerated on its own while traversing a slope, just as incoming artillery struck the position it had vacated seconds earlier. He swore no one had touched the controls. The report was dismissed as stress-induced error, but similar accounts appear in other declassified testimonies. Machines that seemed to anticipate danger, engines that roared seconds before ambushes, and crews who couldn't explain how they survived. Whatever truth lay behind those accounts, the Army moved quickly to erase it. Surviving Hellcats were either exported to foreign allies or scrapped entirely. Those sent to Yugoslavia and Italy were stripped of their original engines and fitted with downgraded versions, ensuring the classified components would never leave American oversight. The official narrative became simple. The M18 was obsolete, a relic of a bygone doctrine. Yet engineers who had worked on the project knew differently. In confidential correspondence, one designer wrote, "We built something we didn't fully understand. It moved faster than physics should have allowed." The destruction of the Hellcat fleet was swift and absolute. By 1948, nearly every original model had disappeared, but fragments of its schematics, the alloy formulas, the throttle algorithms, and the engine's harmonic tuning, were quietly absorbed into post-war aerospace programs. What began as a tank destroyer's secret would soon echo in jet laboratories and rocket test stands across America, the forbidden legacy of a machine that had outrun its own creators. In the years after the war, the M18 Hellcat became little more than a footnote, a curious relic remembered by a handful of veterans and collectors. Official histories praised its speed, its daring design, its battlefield success. But what they never mentioned, what still hides behind layers of missing files and redacted reports, is how the Hellcat's technology quietly shaped America's leap into the Cold War. Its disappearance wasn't an act of obsolescence, it was containment. In 1946, a small division under the Army Air Force's Materiel Command began a classified study called Project Peregrine. Its purpose, to analyze how the Hellcat's lightweight alloys and propulsion harmonics could be adapted for jet-assisted vehicles. The project's scientists, many of them former Buick engineers, were startled to discover that the resonance patterns in the Hellcat's engine and transmission bore similarities to early jet compressor harmonics. What made the tank so fast, they found, wasn't merely its power-to-weight ratio. It was the precise synchronization of mechanical oscillations, a form of tuned kinetic resonance that allowed energy transfer far more efficiently than any tank of its time. That discovery vanished into secrecy almost immediately. Within a year, the Peregrine files were folded into a new research group at Wright Field, whose members later worked on experimental aircraft like the Bell X-1, the plane that broke the sound barrier. Officially, there was no link. Unofficially, fragments of internal correspondence reveal otherwise. One engineer wrote, "We owe the X-series propulsion synchronization to ground tests that never involved an aircraft." The tests he referred to matched the destroyed records of the Hellcat's engine trials. Even more disturbing were the scattered field notes found decades later, notes that suggested some Hellcats were tested with magnetic instrumentation designed for guided munitions. The intent was to measure how high-frequency vibration patterns affected mobility and metal fatigue. But to those who examined the results, it hinted at something unintended, a link between vibration, energy transference, and mechanical instinct. The same ghost reactions reported by Hellcat crews appeared in these controlled tests. The machines responded to stress before it registered on human controls. By 1950, all files referencing the M18's advanced mechanical behavior were sealed under Atomic Energy Commission, subclassified technical archive, where they remain locked to this day. In the official narrative, the Hellcat was a hero of mobility warfare, a bold experiment that ended when heavier armor became necessary. But beneath that narrative lies an unspoken truth. The M18 Hellcat was more than a weapon. It was the accidental birth of an idea that blurred the line between man and machine, a moment when the rush for survival, innovation, and dominance briefly touched the edge of something the world wasn't ready to understand.